Today's presentation as well qualifies for ISMAP CMPP credits. So by attending today's meeting and listening to Dan's presentation, you can obtain 1 credit for CMPP. So if you are looking to do that, please take the screenshot now of this title screen. And these are the learning objectives that Dan has set. So to appreciate the benefits and importance of patient engagement in MedComms, to identify medical activities suited to patient engagement, and to understand some of the barriers to patient engagement and how we can address these. So without any further ado, I would like to hand over to Dan to give his presentation on this topic. And we'll just have to swap over our screen shares.
Yep, thanks very much. I'll get those up now. Great, and hopefully, seamlessly, that will come through looking very much like the title slide you've just seen. Can everyone see that?
Yep, thanks Dan, over to you.
Brilliant, well, thanks very much for the introduction, and good morning, afternoon, wherever you are, everyone. Thanks very much for joining. As has just been mentioned, we'll be focusing today on patient engagement in MedComms, looking at why it's important, what some of the common barriers, perceived or otherwise, to engaging patients are, some practical solutions to those barriers, and then an example or two of what that could look like as part of a medical activity. So what I'm talking about when I refer to patient engagement here is broadly the process of considering patients and or involving them in our work. So this could look like developing materials that are aimed at patients to help them understand their disease better, take a more active role in their sort of healthcare decisions, discussions with their doctor. But it can also mean involving patients in projects in other ways, to ensure that they are able to play an active role in how treatments are developed, assessed, accessed, marketed. And of course, there can be overlap between these things, involving patients in development of materials aimed at other patients, for example. And the idea here is basically to make sure that what we are doing is allowing patients to really engage with their treatment of their condition, whatever that is, and the treatments that are developed with patients' actual needs, not their assumed needs, in mind. So why is it important? I think historically, a lot of people have been quite wary of patient engagement just due to the heavy regulation that there is of interactions between industry more broadly and patients. However, I think as the benefits of patient engagement have become more widely appreciated, that perception has started to shift somewhat. Instead of thinking, why can't we engage with patients, we now have to think about the risks of not engaging with patients. And this could mean that you lose the unique perspectives that patients bring to the table. You risk developing products or materials that are not actually suited to what patients need or what they want. And not doing this can also just impact industry reputation more broadly as well, at a time where I think the general public are just a bit more aware and attuned to what the pharmaceutical industry is doing. But on the flip side, what does it kind of look like if we get it right? Firstly, this can empower patients. I think we'd all probably agree that empowered patients are likely to take a more active interest and role in managing their own health and discussions with their HCP. We'll also have improved relationships and trust between patients and the industry. Products that are developed are more likely to be tailored to the actual patient experience instead of what we assume to be the patient experience. And ultimately, patients will benefit more from the products and services that are developed that actually meet their needs and are tailored to what they really want. But I think it is fair to say that we do come across some barriers here to engage with patients in our day-to-day work, whether this is anyone who works within industry, whether it's as an agency, freelancer. I think today I'm just going to focus on 3 of the more common ones that I think we see mentioned, and those are compliance, time and or budget, and then actually finding patients to engage with. So we'll start off with compliance, which I know is everyone's favourite topic. It's often a concern I think when it comes to patient engagement, because we know that the consequences of getting it wrong could be fairly severe. And I think through working a lot on materials designed for HCPs, especially promotional materials, we're so used to thinking about making sure that a patient doesn't see something, or a member of the general public doesn't see something. And whilst compliance codes do prevent things like advertising to the public in most locations, they're also here to provide a framework for involving patients appropriately and compliantly. However, it does take time to read those guidelines, understand them, action them, whether that be in the way that we find patients, putting contracts in place, how we communicate their role within an activity to them. So as with HCP facing activities, the more time we have, the more likely we are to be compliant. Rushing things is when mistakes tend to happen. But I just wanted to go through a little bit more detail. Some of the options are kind of for looking at codes and guidelines that do provide a bit of a framework for compliant patient engagement. Very briefly here, I'll list a few of the national compliance codes, which I'm sure many of us are all aware of. ABPI, of course, doesn't really apply directly to APAC, but given its reputation as a particularly strict benchmark code, it's worth being aware of. And I guess many of us will work on materials that have been derived from global materials that themselves will have been developed with this code in mind. There are then, of course, a lot of individual country codes within the region. I've just listed here as examples the SAPI code in Singapore, which was very recently revised, and the Medicines Australia code, and I believe the new version is coming into effect at the end of March next year. These provide quite general guidance on kind of the principles for all of the work we do, and although they generally have a bit of a focus on HCP interactions, they do often cover the principles that govern interactions with the general public and patients to an extent, so they are a good starting point. But then we can go beyond that, and we see that there are also a lot of specific guidelines for patient engagement. Again, I've just given the examples here from Singapore and Australia. There are lots more. I can provide these URLs afterwards for everyone to take a look at in their own time. But both of these kind of countries and regulatory bodies have published guidelines for patient engagement specifically. They are really useful resources for knowing what we should and shouldn't be doing. And I think they also show that there's just a real willingness from these bodies to facilitate respectful and compliant patient engagement. There's another really helpful resource here, which is Patient Engagement Synapse, which is part of the sort of patient-focused medicines development sort of collection of resources. And they have developed simplified guides that summarize some of these national codes. Here's an example of one of these summaries from Australia. So you start off with this overview that gives you an idea of what the broad principles are, what the main points will be. Then there are different sections that have this sort of traffic light coding to give you an idea of how thoroughly something is covered within a code and what it might say about a particular element of patient engagement. And then at the end, there's a list of really useful resources. So in this case, for Australia, it's a state-by-state guidance resources around things like patient remuneration. So these are a really, really good place to start. Don't necessarily cover all countries, but it's a good place to start looking for things and to get links to other resources. So I think the message there is check the codes, check the guidelines, start early, and that will give you the best chance of staying compliant. So I think we'll move on now to time and budget. And I think it's fair to say that we often hear there isn't the budget to involve patients, or there isn't time. I think we know that budget does get prioritized. That's not going to change. So it becomes more of a case of providing a rationale for why patient engagement should be prioritized, and almost from a commercial point of view in some cases. So firstly, it does have the potential to increase the reach and quality of publications and other medical materials. I won't spend too long on details here, but there are some data showing that plain language summaries are easier to understand. There was a study that was done here on survey, and this was the case for people who were in science careers, science-related careers, and non-science careers. So across the board, showed that plain language summaries and video abstracts gave a higher rate of understanding. And a lot of patients and patient organisations consider them essential or valuable. On top of this, they can help to increase the reach and impact, with articles generally with plain language summaries receiving more downloads when compared with similar articles that didn't have an accompanying plain language summary. And actually, some of those plain language summaries can themselves kind of in their own right be incredibly high impact and incredibly wide reaching. We've also done a bit of our own research into this, presented at ISMAP, which showed that HCPs tend to use enhanced content to explain information to their patients. I think of the HCPs that we surveyed, half of them did this at least once a month. And they use this enhanced content, which is often written in more patient-friendly language, because it's easier to understand and because it helps a patient to understand their condition or treatment, which I think we'd all agree is a good thing. Next, it also helps to build relationships between patients and industry and HCPs and industry. Patients generally are more likely to trust and want to work with companies that have a good reputation for patient centricity, and this is going to allow those companies to benefit from patients' first-hand insights into research, clinical trial design, other communication materials. So some data here from a survey of 12,000 patients and members of the general public about their attitudes to clinical research. The question was, what might increase your trust in pharmaceutical companies that conduct clinical research studies? So you see that 51%, they said that knowing that a company actively works with patients and caregivers to make clinical research studies easier to participate in would increase their trust, and 48% said that companies sharing information in patient-friendly language would increase their trust. Looking at the HCP side, we then got some data here from a BCG survey of just over 3,000 HCPs across the US, UK, Germany, China, and Japan, showing that 50% of doctors were more likely to prescribe medication from a pharma company they considered to be more patient-centric and would be more willing to engage and work with pharmaceutical companies that they perceived as more patient-centric. And then finally, we also have alignment with regulatory bodies, kind of thinking almost more on the commercial market access side of things. Again, I'm not going to go through loads of detail. I can provide the links afterwards because these guides are quite long. But a lot of regulatory bodies, reimbursement bodies, are increasingly highlighting the importance of engagement with patients and the fact that they actually really want to see this as part of an HTA process. We see this in the UK with NICE, which I know is often seen as a bit of a benchmark for the HTA process. They actually require a summary of information for patients to accompany HTA submissions now. Again, ACE in Singapore recently released some guidelines on patient involvement in the HTA process and really wants to capture the patient voice within their process. And then the PBAC in Australia also providing statements here around incorporating the patient voice and the different ways that patients, caregivers can provide input into that. And then I think beyond this, it is estimated that there are fairly substantial economic benefits to involving patients throughout the drug development process. I think, if you're looking at these HTA bodies and you just need to get reimbursement or get access and they're asking for patient involvement, then that's a good start. But, we've also got things like involving patients at early clinical trial design phases to reduce the number of protocol amendments they have to make to get faster recruitment, to have better retention through that trial. Developing the communication of research findings in a way that the patients are going to understand. And this, this estimate here that drugs developed using patient-centric designs are 19% more likely to be launched. I think, when we're thinking about time and budget as an argument for not doing patient engagement, I think actually it's arguably the other way around. It would be the argument for doing patient engagement. So the question almost switches from, can I afford to involve patients, to can I really afford not to involve patients? I'm sure by this point, of course, we're all totally on board with the idea of involving patients. We think it's great. Absolutely, let's go and do it. So how do we actually find them? I think is a fair, practical question. And I think as in the same way as how we often engage with HCPs, it's crucial to see it as a long-term partnership as opposed to just a single transaction. And, sometimes we have to think about patient engagement in a different way, but sometimes we can think about it in a very similar way to the things we do. Patients are not, we're all patients. Patients are not some alien life form. They're people in the same way that HCPs are that we interact with on a regular basis. Thinking about the practicalities, though, there are a few different ways to go about this if we're not quite sure where to start. Patient advocacy groups are a really good place to start. They often have existing relationships with patients. They can help to bridge that gap initially between pharma and patients, as well as provide advice on how to do it. Clinics, potentially establish relationships with clinics might mean that they will be willing to help advertise for patients who want to be involved in certain patient engagement initiatives. There are patient experts in specific fields who are experienced in engaging with pharma and medtech and can be found with desk research. They can get very involved in webinars, symposia, things like that. And there are also specialized patient recruitment companies. There's an example here called Rare Patient Voice, which I believe is active in parts of APAC. And they provide services to patient advocacy groups and the pharma industry that include patient recruitment with the kind of broader aim of giving patients and caregivers a voice. So hopefully that was a helpful run through of some of the ways to tackle some of these fairly common and reasonable barriers, I think. And I just wanted to kind of summarize a little bit by just going through a sort of case study, an example here where kind of working with a patient advocacy group allows you to overcome some of these barriers, and is a really good place to start. So the aim of this project was to conduct a survey to explore health-related quality of life of adults and children with a rare disease and their caregivers, and this was in collaboration with a patient advocacy group. So to begin with, they just have a lot of expertise, and it meant that we were able to work with them to ensure that this survey actually captures the elements of the condition that do genuinely matter most to patients and caregivers, so that it's worthwhile doing this work. A wider participant reach, and I just talked about patient recruitment being difficult, but this allows us to make the most of a trusted relationship between patients and caregivers and the patient advocacy group to advertise the survey, recruit participants, ensure that patients are comfortable with what they're doing, ensure that this engagement is respectful. It's a really good way, again, to bridge that gap. And then, of course, the accessibility and compliance side of things, which is really important. So this meant we were able to design a plain language survey, the advertising for that survey, the patient information forms to go along with it, along with the support from that advocacy group, making sure that language was accessible for all of those patients, children, adults, and their caregivers. Made sure that it wasn't too long, test it to make sure it is actually user-friendly, that patients are going to want to and be able to fill this in a way that's useful, and go through all the relevant compliance considerations, including, not having client branding, not mentioning pharmaceutical products, things like that. So I think it's one of those things where we don't need to do this all by ourselves. Like, there are, as with many things that maybe we don't have direct expertise in, there are groups and people out there that do have this expertise, and these patient advocacy groups often want to be engaged with this sort of thing. I think, building a relationship with them is really important, and can really facilitate doing this sort of impactful work. And I think just to finish on just a few points, I guess, that summarize ways that we can maximize the benefits of patient engagement. We've talked about this already, but consider this early in the planning process. The earlier we start thinking about this, the easier it is to make sure it's compliant, the easier it is to make sure everything we're doing is accessible to patients, that it's suited to patients, and it is necessary to do, and it makes life a lot easier much further along the way. It really does need to be a sustained partnership, not a single transaction. Trying to foster that long-term relationship makes it easier to have future patient engagement opportunities. Following up to enable patients to see what impact they've actually made is makes it far more likely that they're going to want to do this sort of thing again. Don't make assumptions. I think it's easy to fall into the trap of making assumptions about what we think patients want and what they need, and it might not always be the case. Instead of just developing a material that's aimed at patients without speaking to a patient, we should involve them in the process. We don't need to assume, we can ask. And then, yes, exactly, patient targeting materials can and should be reviewed by patients. We don't just need to involve patients as the end audience for these things, but they can be involved in much earlier stages. So we've got some useful resources here. I won't go through them all now. When the recording gets sent out, we'll put these URLs either in the email or with the recording. So you'll be able to see those along with all of the national codes and guidelines that I presented earlier. But just briefly, patient-focused medicines development, PFMD, is a really good starting point. It's got the patient engagement synapse, which has those guides to summarize national codes of conduct that I mentioned, And the patient engagement management suite has so many resources there as well. There is then an enhanced publications options navigator, which I've linked here, which is a tool for finding information about journals and their guidelines on plain language summaries, enhanced content, open access. And then there are multiple apps. I've just listed one here, Hemingway, which gives you, it kind of assesses your writing to see how kind of patient friendly something might be and how clear it might be, with different colors here. You can see in the example that indicate sentences that might be too long, too complex, too weak, too passive, things like that. So yes, we can provide these afterwards. And I think that's about my 20 minutes, so I'll stop there. And I guess before we go into breakout, invite any questions.